And then there's also error in measurement when it comes to achievement testing. So now, we're kind of restricting ourselves to one number when there could be a lot of error in measurement. So I've had families come to me in clinic and say, well, he missed qualifying by 2 points. So what that means is, let's say, this kid had an IQ of 100, which is solidly average, and their reading score was 75. And now I don't think this is an IQ versus reading. This is just a table. This is just for illustration. But is that kid impaired if they have an IQ of 100 and their achievement score is 75? Absolutely. Absolutely, that kid is experiencing difficulty. Would they qualify with this table? No. And that is why it drives me batty. Not to mention that when we are doing multiple comparisons, just mathematically, if we have error in measurement and we're doing multiple comparisons, the more comparisons we do with error, the more likely we are to commit an error. So I like, as a psychologist, being able to look at a pattern and a profile and make a clinical decision that's informed and based on the research. That's what I was trying to do. Don't take it away from me. So achievement scores. So this, I'm going to talk about this article in here. So they looked at who they would identify in as having a learning disability in the normative sample that was used for the Woodcock-Johnson. So they looked at, over like 3,700 kids that were part of the normative sample. And they looked at, I missed a slide, I did not. They looked at if they used the general intellectual ability measure, which can sometimes be depressed due to kind of the multiple different cognitive processes that kind of factor into it. And we know with a learning disability, sometimes some of those processes are a weakness. So they looked at if they used that general intellectual ability, or the GFGC, which is just fluid reasoning. If they use that, did it make a difference in terms of what kids were identified? So they defined a learning disability as either the GIA score or the GFGC score being 15 points greater than the achievement score. And the kiddo also had to have at least one basic psychological process that was less than 85. So if we, kind of as predicted, if we use the GFGC method, they identified significantly more kids that would be diagnosed with a learning disability using this formula. So if you just look at kind of fluid reasoning abilities, you'll see more kids that achieve lower than expected. And fluid reasoning is really just the ability to kind of solve novel problems, and it's not based upon any, learned vocabulary or any past experiences. It's, speed of processing is not a factor. It's just kind of based on your ability to reason. What is concerning is that with either method, Black students were more likely to be identified as having a learning disability, and white students were less likely to be identified as having a learning disability. And the risk ratios for Black and white students are quite different. So they were about 1.5 for Black students and about 0.75 to 0.86 for white students, depending upon what method was used. Ideally, the risk ratio would be 1 if this was truly a valid, culturally appropriate way of identifying a kid with a learning disability. And only 44% were identified using both methods. Now, the correlation between the GIA and the GFGC is about 0.86, according to this article. So they say you'd expect that there would be an overlap more like 75%. But yet we only found a 44% overlap in terms of kids identified with both methods. So this is kind of concerning, right? The method we use can really affect who we, if an ability achievement model can really affect who we identify as having a learning disability. So when we are kind of super rigid about the formula we use, we risk both being biased and we risk false negatives. And we really need to be gathering a wealth of data and looking at it holistically than kind of restricting ourselves to a rigid ability achievement discrepancy. And I'll talk a bit about what gathering that data might look like. So the bottom line with the ability achievement discrepancy, the test material selected will impact who is found eligible. School psychologists and diagnosticians have a responsibility to understand the psychological processes that make up IQ, how they are derived by test developers, and whether or not there have been independent studies looking at the validity of those processes. You know, in our field, we're told as soon as a new test is out, you know, within a year, you know, you're supposed to kind of adopt the new test, although I really can't find any very specific guidance on that. But if there isn't good research behind the new test, maybe we look for a different test, right? We need to be making research-based decisions. We have a responsibility to look at the psychometric properties of the test beyond those published by the test developer, because they're biased. They have a product to sell. They may do some good science, but they also may miss the mark. School psychologists and diagnosticians must also understand how to interpret a profile and identify when indices are invalid. I have seen a lot of reports where the FSIQ, the full scale IQ, is used, and I look at the profile and there is like a 27-point difference between two indexes. Like, the full scale IQ is not really interpretable in that situation. But I will give school psychologists some credit, having been one in this state too, in that when you have 100+ evaluations to complete in 172 school days, combined with 26 snow days, you don't really have the luxury of doing those 3 points above, right? Like a lot of times we're just in survival mode, right? We have families at home that we need to take care of. We're tired of writing reports in our free time. You know, after our children go to bed, and we have a shortage of school psychologists in this state. So a lot of school psychologists are just presented with unreasonable ratios and are not able to put their training to good use. And I experienced that as a school psychologist as well. So we need more school psychologists in order to be able to do this job well. So what I will say about the discrepancy model is if it could work for us, it really, really would be lovely. It really would be lovely because it's standardized and it's quick, right? I can have my test kits, I can crank out assessments, I can look at the data, give a diagnosis, move on to the next kid. Like that sounds pretty attractive. But if we're not careful, it can lead to disproportionality in identification. We do kind of have to wait for a child to fail if we just rely on this model. And if we wait for a child to fail, we set them up for continued failure. We have to intervene early. We rely on a score that summarizes intelligence, which may not be valid, and it limits which tests are used. And I will say that, you know, the regulations do say that if for some reason, you know, the overall score is determined not to be valid, there are some other options, and the school psychologist can make an argument for using, you know, a different score. But I just think kind of in the interest of time, sometimes that's a difficult thing to do as well. So also, if we are doing our job in special education, when it comes to the 3-year reevaluation, the kid may not have that severe discrepancy anymore. Really, if we're doing our job, hopefully they don't. But then what happens if we just dismiss them from special education, right? In another couple of years, where are they going to be at? Are they going to be struggling again? Another thing to keep in mind too is that the cognitive process that is involved in a learning disability, right, can depress those overall cognitive ability scores. So we have to be able to look at the profile critically. And a lot of measures of intelligence include aspects of achievement. So the WAIS has an arithmetic subscale in order to measure working memory. It has a vocabulary subscale where you have to define and describe different vocabulary words. It has a similarity subscale where you have to be able to identify how two words relate to each other in a clear and concise way. Well, if you have a learning disability in any one of those areas, your score on those indexes are going to be lowered, and then your overall IQ is going to be lowered, and then you're not going to qualify because your IQ isn't discrepant enough from your achievement score. Like that, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So we need to be able to look at the patterns that we're seeing. And again, measurement error occurs in all testing. And when we're making multiple comparisons, that measurement error is compounded, and we're more likely to make an error in diagnosis. The other thing is, other than, I think, the Woodcock-Johnson, right? So if we're comparing different normative samples too, right? So if we're doing like the WAIS and the Wyatt, we may be talking about different normative samples as well when we're doing this discrepancy model, which introduces more error. And it excludes children with cognitive processing difficulties with lesser cognitive abilities too, right? So you really, if you have an IQ of like 85, you have to be really low academically, right, in order to qualify as having a learning disability under this model. And is that fair? So I'm just going to give you just a sample profile. And I didn't even put the full scale IQ in here when I did this one because I didn't think it was valid. And that's kind of how I rule as a psychologist. If I don't think it's valid, I don't let you look at the number because I don't want you to get hung up on it. So I didn't put it in here. But so this is a person who I felt like had a learning disability. And if we look at their profile, instead of giving you the full scale IQ, I gave you kind of the general ability, which we measure by looking at their verbal skills and their visual spatial skills. And their general ability is pretty solidly average. And then we looked at kind of what's called their proficiency index, or kind of what's their processing speed, what's their measure of, working memory, and that, as you can tell, is kind of much lower than their general ability. So I didn't want to use a full scale IQ because I didn't think that would give a fair picture to the split in this person's ability. So basically this person is of average intelligence, but they need more time in order to be able to demonstrate their ability. And then we see block design is depressed, and so it's, at a scaled score of 6 versus, the other scaled scores in that index are like 13 and 9. And the thing that you would know as a school psychologist with this is that block design is a timed task, right? So, we'd have to kind of look, well, is this a visual spatial processing deficit, or is time a factor here? And then we look at kind of where this person's academics are. So I think, and I didn't look, but I think if I pulled the tables out on this person and did an ability achievement discrepancy, they would probably not qualify. But if we kind of look at their cognitive profile, and then we look at their academic profile, we can see that there is a pattern of strengths and weaknesses, especially in decoding and in basic reading. And so, to me, and again, we would need more data than just this, right, to diagnose this person with a learning disability. We would need some information from the school. We would need kind of an understanding of what had been tried. We would need to understand what this person's environment had been like, what their school attendance had been like, if there are any other diagnoses. We just would need a lot more information. But, you know, I would feel from looking at this that I would be able to argue that this person is having, experiencing impairment in reading and math calculation. And that really, if we look at their verbal scores at 116, that their impairment in reading is probably unexpected. But again, we need more data. Data. So school psychologists in our code of ethics have a responsibility to use techniques and practices that the profession considers to be responsible and research-based. And the National Association of School Psychologists has been pretty clear that it does not find the ability achievement discrepancy model to be responsible research-based practice. Yet, at school psychologists in this state, depending upon which district they're in, are sometimes stuck with using this model. You know, you don't really have the luxury of a school psychologist to go to your special ed department chair or your director of special ed and be like, nah, I don't think I'm going to use that model that, you know, district has outlined in the policy. So, you know, I feel them, but I think it is the responsibility for us to kind of speak up for what we think is responsible research-based practice and push back on it. And I also feel that too, you know, IDEA states that we need to use a variety of tools and strategies to gather relevant information. One IQ test and one academic achievement test is not a variety of tools and strategies. Assessments may not be discriminatory on a racial or cultural basis. I think we have literature, including this recent article, demonstrating that this method could very well be discriminatory. And assessments go beyond providing a single general intelligence quotient. Well, the ability and achievement method, in a way, forces, I mean, there are some options in terms of what's used as a measure of ability, but it can easily kind of force us into that pigeonhole. So anyway, in recent meme land, this is kind of what it feels like, right? So, you know that your child can't read, you know that your child is struggling to read. They go through the assessment process and, you know, you're like, well, they're not low in reading enough, right? They're not 1.5 standard deviations exactly below where their ability is. Okay. So response to intervention. There is another guidance document on this, on the Kentucky Systems of Intervention that I recommend reading. I think in terms of consistency and operationalization, right, that there's a little more consistency between the method defined and what's in the administrative regulations. But basically, response to intervention is where we're looking at a child's response to scientific research-based practices. We're looking at their progress, and we're looking at, we're using data analysis, and we're looking to see if they're achieving at a rate of learning enough to make sufficient progress to meet standards. So, have y'all seen the triangle? Y'all been triangled out at this point? The theory is that if we're implementing response to intervention well in schools, 80% of kids will be just fine. About 20% of kids will need some extra intervention or support, and about 5% will need some intensive individualized intervention. However, if you have ever worked in a school where a lot of the kids are underperforming for whatever reason, if you're trying to implement response to intervention, you're ending up in a situation where about 20% of your kids are at tier 3 or 40% of your kids are at tier 2, this is what it kind of feels like, right? It feels like you're bailing out a sinking boat. And the theory behind response to intervention is that you implement a really strong core curriculum so that you can plug that hole, and then you can start to do the work of bailing it out. But it can be a pretty overwhelming process to start, especially when you have a lot of kids in your school who have really intense needs. This is how the Kentucky system of intervention is kind of defined. And response to intervention is a part of it. And as part of this, schools should be using universal screening to kind of catch if any kids are falling behind, should be using data to make decisions, using evidence-based instruction, monitoring students' progress, delivering services in tiers, looking to make sure those things are delivered with fidelity. So that means, if you have a research-based practice, but somebody just kind of wings it in terms of providing it, well, is it the implementer or the kid who's the problem, right? So if you're doing an evidence-based practice, you need it to be implemented how it's designed to be implemented in order to say whether or not the kid responds to it. We also have to have family involvement and communication, and I'll talk a bit more about that, and then access for teachers to professional development. And the goal is to close the achievement gap, to help students be ready to learn, smooth their transition, make them college and career ready. So the requisites for RTI are really a tall order. So changing any school system, whether you're implementing positive behavior interventions and supports, which is a multi-tiered intervention, or a response to intervention on the academic side, it takes like 3 to 5 years to really get it rolling well, right? So even just implementing an evidence-based core curriculum with fidelity that's going to result in about 80% of your kids responding is going to take several years. It takes time to do well. Oh, and we also have to provide differentiated instruction for all learners. Any teacher is going to tell you that that's also a tall order. We need a system, a system in place that assesses student achievement, a system in place to monitor their progress at regular intervals, a system in place to review that data, and a system in place to implement evidence-based interventions with fidelity. That's really hard, challenging work. It's hard. A district can't be like, oh, I think we're going to do RTI, right? There's a lot of groundwork and planning and development that goes into implementing this. It is an entire framework, and it takes years to get going well. So yes, it's best practice, and it's very hard. So prior to referral, so the idea with RTI and the special ed identification process is that prior to referral, they've been provided with research-based practices. Their progress has been monitored for a sufficient amount of time. I don't think anybody knows what a sufficient amount of time is. Exactly, what is a sufficient amount of time to allow for change? I mean, it's definitely not a week, but what it is beyond that is kind of hard to define exactly. The DSM says 6 months. Some people will tell you 6 weeks. Some people will tell you 8 weeks. It's hard to know exactly what sufficient is. We need those interventions to be implemented, again, as they're meant to be implemented. And that's really difficult to do. Doesn't seem like it should be, but it is. We also have to make sure the student has participated in these interventions consecutively and consistently. So again, this is repetitive absences can get in the way here. Or just snow days can get in the way, right? So you're trying to implement RTI in January and February and March, right? That can be really hard to do. You need to be able to demonstrate that their performance is unrelated to behavior. Well, I can tell you too that I would rather act a fool than be dumb, right? So that's hard to demonstrate as well. And when we get to that, then we have to get into, is it a can't do problem or is it a won't do problem, right? So we have to do the can't do versus won't do assessment. And usually when I do that as a psychologist, I get the kid in the room and I incorporate a good bit of bribery, right? To see if it's, they don't want to do this particular task or they can't do it. And the student has received, we have to demonstrate that they've received appropriate instruction and intervention along the way. So that's a lot of prerequisites. Like, this is before we can refer the kid. So I think that's why a lot of times, I hear from parents, like I've had parents come into my office and they've said, if I hear about one more tier, don't even say the word tier to me. If I hear about one more tier, I am going to lose it. Because it's a difficult process. While not required, districts may still choose to administer cognitive and intellectual assessments. So you may still choose to administer them. And my advice would be to still administer them. I think it provides an important piece of data. The more data we have, the better. So how do we know we have a problem? We have a need. So the ability level relative to peers is discrepant. And you can look at that relative to peers within the school, within the class, within the district, nationally. And people sometimes ask, well, which one do I choose? And my opinion is, why don't we look at all of it, right? And then just see where they are according to different standards. I mean, I think all of that is valuable information. And then we need to look at their rate of learning and improvement. Is there any hope with what we're doing that they're going to catch up? And so that's kind of definition based on the literature. This is from the, and it's similar, from the SLD eligibility guidance document. So we have unexplained underachievement, insufficient growth. So what does it take for the student to learn at the expected rate? And I think the guidance document poses a really important question. What is the intensity of their instructional need? And I think this is an answer to my parent who said, if I hear about one more tier, I'm going to lose it, right? What happens if we take this kid out of RTI? Have we been maintaining RTI for years to keep this kid where they need to be? And if we find that we cannot get this kid out of RTI, then doesn't that argue that they need extra services and supports? And should we formalize this through an IEP? So, is the student's learning pattern such that we need sustained intervention? Is it, if we remove the intervention, do they regress? What happens? And I don't, I experience as a clinician a lot of, I hear about a lot of miscommunication between schools and parents, and I don't think really either party is at fault. But, really parents should be notified about the child's performance data and the services provided. They should be aware if their child is at tier 2 or tier 3 and what their rate of learning is and what interventions are being provided. Even better, the parent should be provided with some suggestions for what to do at home. And they should also be notified of their right to request an evaluation. So when it comes to RTI and timelines, interventions and progress monitoring should continue as part of the evaluation process for special education eligibility. So a referral to special ed cannot be delayed just because a student has not moved through all tiers of the RTI process. So remember that little meme I had where they're like, we haven't done all 3 tiers yet? Well, you can't do that. You can't delay a special ed referral just because the kid hasn't moved through RTI. So the Department of Special Education at the federal level has been very clear about this. They sent out a memo on January 21st, 2011 that said a RTI cannot be used to deny an evaluation for eligibility under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So what that means is that when there's, a request for evaluation for a specific learning disability, RTI cannot be, you can't say, well, we have to do RTI first. You can say, we'll do RTI during the timeline and, we'll do our best to do response to intervention and implement evidence-based interventions and monitor progress during the evaluation timeline. But you can't delay because RTI hasn't been done.